The night was unusually silent over Kyiv. The city lights glowed faintly under a blanket of mist, and for a brief moment, it felt as if time itself had slowed. But behind the silence, an earthquake of tension was forming. Reports were pouring in from intelligence networks across Europe and beyond. 10 nations were mobilizing, preparing to enter the theater of Ukraine's war. The whispers spread fast. Governments, military analysts, civilians, all trying to grasp the impossible. The words invasion and Ukraine appeared together on every headline, but what made it stranger was the phrase attached at the end. But it's not what you think. The world leaned forward, trying to decode the mystery. At a secret NATO command bunker in Brussels, generals studied satellite images. Convoys of tanks, troop carriers, and aircraft formations were clearly visible. They weren't Russian, but they weren't Ukrainian either. The colors of different nations' flags painted the machinery: Polish, Romanian, German, American, British, Canadian, French, even units from countries far beyond Europe. 10 nations, moving in unison, moving toward Ukraine. The first thought was obvious. Had NATO decided to intervene directly in the war? But even that theory didn't quite explain the scale, the secrecy, and the synchronized precision of what was unfolding. Inside Ukraine, soldiers in trenches along the Eastern Front received confused updates. Rumors of an invasion swirled among exhausted men. Some feared betrayal, imagining a new occupation. Others clung to hope that maybe, just maybe, these nations weren't enemies, but saviors. President Zelensky sat in a secure underground chamber, staring at the reports. His advisors bombarded him with questions. Was Ukraine about to be crushed by the very allies it had depended on? Or was this some new strategy, a gamble that might finally turn the tide? The truth was more complex than anyone realized. The first signs it began with Poland. Satellite images caught massive armored brigades crossing their own borders, assembling in staging areas. Not long after, Germany mobilized an expeditionary force. Britain's aircraft carriers in the North Sea adjusted course. France quietly shifted Mirage and Rafale squadrons eastward. Canada and the US began loading heavy equipment onto transport planes. Even nations like Italy, Spain, and Norway were spotted mobilizing specialized forces. All in all, 10 nations. But instead of pointing their guns at Ukraine, they did something far stranger. Their formations positioned themselves along Ukraine's borders not to attack Kyiv, but to protect it. Still, the Ukrainian...
The fear on the streets. In Kharkiv, mothers clutched their children tighter as news anchors announced that 10 foreign armies are marching toward Ukrainian territory. In Odessa, fishermen abandoned their nets to gather around radios, whispering about whether this was the beginning of another occupation. Fear has a way of spreading faster than facts. For a nation already scarred by invasion, the thought of another one, even by supposed allies, was unbearable. But behind closed doors, the truth was slowly being revealed. A meeting in Warsaw. In a heavily guarded conference room in Warsaw, defense ministers from the 10 nations sat together. Maps of Ukraine stretched across the table. One by one, they spoke. "This is not an invasion," said the German minister. "This is a shield," added the British general. "If Ukraine falls, the rest of Europe will burn," the Polish commander declared. What they were planning was unprecedented. Not to occupy Ukraine, but to draw an iron wall around it. 10 nations, acting together, not to conquer, but to send a signal to Moscow: the line is here. Cross it again, and you face us all. It was not an invasion of conquest. It was an invasion of protection. Back in Kyiv, Zelensky finally received the encrypted briefing. His hands trembled slightly as he listened. The plan sounded almost impossible. 10 foreign militaries would march into Ukraine, but instead of seizing control, they would integrate with Ukrainian command, fortifying borders, guarding critical infrastructure, and preparing for a final showdown. It was both a miracle and a nightmare. For some Ukrainians, the sight of foreign soldiers on their soil brought back painful memories of centuries of occupations. For others, it meant salvation, proof that the world hadn't abandoned them. As dawn broke, the first convoys crossed the Polish border into western Ukraine. Thousands of armored vehicles rolled across highways, their engines thundering like storms. Fighter jets from France and Britain streaked across the sky, flying low, rattling windows in Lviv. American Black Hawk helicopters flew escort, their silhouettes black against the rising sun. Civilians rushed into the streets, watching with wide eyes. Children waved flags, elders muttered prayers, some cried with relief, some cried with fear. Ukraine was no longer fighting alone. The Kremlin's reaction. In Moscow, the news hit like a hammer. Putin's war council erupted in chaos. 10 nations, acting in near-perfect secrecy, had just positioned themselves inside Ukraine without firing a single shot. "This is not an alliance. This is an invasion," one general barked. But others disagreed. "No shots fired. No cities occupied. It's a message." For the first time in months, the Kremlin's iron confidence wavered. The battlefield shifts. On the Eastern Front, Ukrainian soldiers who had spent weeks under relentless artillery fire suddenly saw a different sight. High-tech radar trucks from Germany set up positions beside them. Polish mechanized brigades rolled into their trench lines, handing out rations and reinforcing bunkers. British engineers began laying down advanced anti-drone systems. At night, American drones painted the sky with infrared beams, spotting Russian positions miles away. Ukrainian commanders couldn't believe their eyes. Their allies weren't just sending weapons anymore. They had sent themselves. The morale shift was immediate. Exhausted Ukrainian soldiers straightened their backs, their faces hardening with new resolve. The impossible suddenly felt possible. But the dangers. Yet with every action comes risk. Russia could interpret this as a direct act of war against NATO, and the world could plunge into a conflict far deadlier than anything before. And, as intelligence soon revealed, the Kremlin wasn't going to take this quietly. Satellite images showed Russia's own forces repositioning. Missiles were being fueled. Bombers were moved to forward bases. In the Black Sea, the Russian fleet stirred like a predator ready to strike. The world held its breath. A mother's perspective. Far from the war rooms and the politics, ordinary Ukrainians faced the human side of this shift. In a small town outside Kyiv, a mother named Irina tucked her 2 children into bed. She told them not to be afraid of the roaring machines outside, that those soldiers were here to protect, not to hurt. But deep down, even she wasn't sure if that was true. Her son asked a simple question. "Mama, if 10 countries are here, does that mean the war will finally end?" Irina kissed his forehead, hiding her tears. "I hope so, my love. I hope so." The story was only just beginning. 10 nations had crossed into Ukraine. The world was watching. Russia was preparing to strike back. And Ukraine, caught in the middle, stood at the edge of history. The invasion had begun, but it was not what anyone thought. The air in Kyiv was heavy with uncertainty, yet buzzing with determination. The announcement that 10 nations were preparing to invade Ukraine had sent shockwaves across the globe. On the surface, it sounded like the nightmare scenario Ukrainians had fought to avoid since 2022. But behind the scenes, the truth was far more nuanced, and, perhaps, even more powerful than outright military force. The story was not one of enemies preparing to conquer, but of allies preparing to transform the battlefield itself, not with tanks and missiles, but with strategic deployments, military advisors, advanced defense systems, and economic warfare so sharp it cut deeper than any bomb.